Welcome back to another edition of the Mintcast, the video podcast from Mint Press News. We're going behind the headlines and diving into the biggest issues of the day that big media tend not to focus on. I'm your host this week, Alan McLeod. Today, we're going to be focusing on Northeast Asia, a region that, as the United States turns up the pressure against China, will become increasingly crucial in world affairs. Here in the West, we're often presented a simplistic view of the region with model democracies such as Japan and South Korea vying against cartoonishly evil bad guys like China and North Korea. But how accurate is that picture really? Joining the show today is investigative reporter Tim Shorrock. Tim knows the region extremely well, having grown up in Japan and covered Korean politics since the 1970s. You can find his work at The Nation and at his own website, timshorrock.com. But before we get into it, if you like the show and want to see it grow, please do consider supporting us financially on Patreon. There will be a link in the description of whatever you're watching or listening to this. And if you're not in a position to help financially, you can still help us by liking and sharing this content with your friends and colleagues. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Tim.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to have you on the show for the first time. Let's start off with Japan, I guess. I think there are two pictures of Japanese society that are often painted. One is of a very harmonious place with very low rates of crime and inequality, a model democracy, if you will. Yet under the surface, another story can be told, one where the same Liberal Democratic Party, which has held extremely close connections to the CIA, has held virtual monopolistic power over the island since the 1950s. How would you describe Japanese politics then, in a nutshell?
Well, I would say, Japan is a strong democracy. There's no doubt about that. I think that and it is, a fairly harmonious society, and there's not a lot of crime. But beneath the surface, there's a lot of tension and a lot of problems and issues that affect people. But it's true that the ruling party, the Liberal Democratic Party, has been in power since 1955, almost uninterrupted. And in periods when it's lost elections and it's been out of power to more progressive forces, the U.S. has really, put the pressure on those progressive governments to, not oppose U.S. policy and to sort of keep the status quo, and they've been very effective at pressuring them. The problem is Japan, since during the Korean War, the U.S. forced a peace treaty on them. That was part of a security treaty that was also signed the same day at the peace treaty, 1951. And that essentially kept U.S. forces in Japan forever. And so the U.S. has had, major bases all over Japan, and, 70% of them are on this islands of Okinawa, which take up 0.5% of the land in Japan. So it's a huge amount of bases in Okinawa. And, these are the most important bases the U.S. has in the Far East. Kadena Air Force Base, Futenma Marine Air Corps Base, and there's many other bases all around. And the U.S. is continually building these bases. And that's where there is no democracy. In Okinawa, the people have opposed the bases, opposed expansion of the bases. And the LDP has basically, tried to buy out the people with massive public spending and to tap down any opposition to the bases. But the opposition is still very strong. Another aspect of the U.S.-Japan military alliance is that the U.S. military has almost uninterrupted control of Japanese skies. It's pretty astonishing when you think about it, because on a regular basis, American military helicopters fly low over Tokyo and other cities, and no other Japanese aircraft, even military aircraft, can't do that. And so it's a democracy And it's I would say that it's moved from being very, when I was growing up there in the 50s and 60s, people really rose up. So all aspects of the society were opposed to the U.S. bases and also their use in the Korean War and later in Vietnam. And there was a very strong and powerful left until the mid 70s, I would say. But even beyond that, the Socialist Party of Japan was part of the electoral, had a major number of seats in the Diet in the National Assembly or Parliament there for many years. The opposition has kind of diminished in recent years, but it's really changed from a very kind of radical a population that was not anti-American, but against the U.S. bases and the use of Japan in its wars, to today a kind of quiet acceptance of this. And because the American bases are mostly in Okinawa, it allows Japanese to kind of forget about the large number of American soldiers that are there. I mean, it's important for people to know that the combination of soldiers, U.S. military in Japan and South Korea and Okinawa is more than half of all American soldiers stationed overseas. So this is a very big base for the U.S. But like what I learned from reporting there, particularly just being there as a kid, and then and reporting out of there in the 80s and 90s, when I did most of my reporting out of Japan, is that when the movement there began to concentrate on other issues other than the U.S. military and the wars in Korea and Vietnam. I should back up a little bit because, in 1960, there was a huge movement against the re-signing of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty that had been signed in 1951. And then in 1970, there was another massive movement, huge demonstrations in 69 and 70 against the U.S. bases. But the Japanese government and ruling class in those second series of demonstrations in 1970, what they did was they sort of depopulated Tokyo, the part where the government was and where all the government offices were, right? They just shut the whole thing down. And so people were demonstrating, but there was nobody to see them, in that area near the Diet and where all the government offices are. And so it kind of, took the power out of the public demonstrations because they were just protesting with nobody to see in the government. They couldn't really, the government wasn't redressing their grievances, in other words. And people kind of learned a lesson from all of that. And they weren't able to stop the treaty. And people began to organize on sort of a local level, like opposing the building of nuclear power plants or trying to stop the rapid, so much industrialization that the environment was really being damaged. And so there was kind of a turn inward to let's make Japan a more humane place. And people found that, on a local level, democracy was not there. I mean, it was very difficult for local people to protest, nuclear power plants, for example. They just, the way that it was structured, it was very difficult to really get citizen input into that kind of thing. And so this kind of corporate state really rolled over Japanese people and resistance to, certain aspects of the over-industrialization. Because there wasn't the local democracy in a lot of places, did not exist. So it's a real mixed bag when you talk about democracy. But I think that the LDP was also able to kind of buy off rural areas there was a land reform in Japan where tenant farmers got land from landowners, and it was fairly effective in shutting down rural protests at the time. But because Japan really protected its rice culture and protected it from outside imports, that rural areas became the subject of a lot of huge amounts of spending by the Liberal Democratic Party, and so they would build these huge projects, all kinds of projects in areas outside of the big cities, and sort of citizens would vote for the LDP because they're the ones bringing in all this money and bringing in all this development. But until about the 1990s, Japan was able to spend money on economic development, building high-speed trains that we don't have, from the mid 60s on, because they weren't spending huge amounts on the military. They were not building a large standing military, and that began to change in the 1990s, and now they're spending record amounts on building up their military.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this question of bases and the Japanese military, like so many things, it goes back to World War II, doesn't it? Of course, the United States defeated and then occupied Japan militarily from 1945, and it's never left. Recent reports say there are over 50,000 US troops stationed across more than 120 bases in Japan. As you said, the most controversial of these are in Okinawa, which, we've seen decades and decades of struggle and even national resistance against these bases. And yet the government in Tokyo still refuses to act despite the public opposition to the US presence. In fact, Tokyo right now is trying to force through the construction of yet another US base on the island. And it was also trying to turn Japan into a major service hub for the repair of US warships. Not only that, you alluded to the fact that under US pressure, Japan is really moving away from its long-standing pacifist foreign policy. Presumably, this is in order to tool up for a US-led war against China in the near future. So after really thinking about all this, I'm led to believe, I'm starting to think, the question comes up that how sovereign a country is Japan if its government puts its wishes of the US military above its own people? And how much does the US really still affect Japanese politics and society and the economy to this day?
It's difficult to call a country sovereign when another country's military has control of its airspace. But the United States has been, I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, the first couple of years of the U.S. occupation were very positive. I mean, Japan was a fascist imperial dictatorship, and the occupation, they made major changes, and a democratic revolution took place. Women got the right to vote. Labor unions were free to organize. People that had been political prisoners, mostly communists, were freed from their jail cells, and war criminals were locked up, and the war departments, the Navy, the Army, were abolished, and people really took advantage of these new democratic rights, and the labor movement, unions spread like crazy in the first couple of years. In fact, workers were like taking over factories because capitalists weren't investing and were kind of like waiting to see what would happen. And workers took them over and started making, basic, keeping them running so they could provide basic goods. And this kind of explosion of communist influence, but just a kind of, people trying to take control of their own lives once again after years and years and years of this kind of military oppression, began to alarm the United States and began to alarm, the economic interests that run U.S. economic foreign policy, including, major American corporations that had investments in pre-war Japan, and were very interested in maintaining these kind of relationships. And so around 1948, actually starting in 1947, but really in 1948, 49, the U.S. policy shifted to what Japanese call the reverse occupation. And a lot of these, sort of the war criminals that had been put in jail were released, and the communists that had been released earlier were put back in jail. And there was a major purge of the left and unions, and a huge crackdown on the left and popular movements. But that popular movement, socialists and communists, still pressed on. And it wasn't until 1955 when two conservative parties merged. And a lot of these parties included people who had been in the government during the war. So these real reactionary groups are representing, big business and the interests of big business, of big landlords, and so on. These parties merged, and that's when the CIA began this program of millions and millions of dollars to support this LDP. And the leaders of it, some of whom, one in particular, Nobusuke Kishi, who had been a Class A war criminal, he had run the Japanese colony in Manchuria. He was, exonerated, and he was trotted around, and Vice President Nixon brought him to the U.S., and, he was brought to introduce Americans to this great new Japanese democratic leader. Nobody heard, no one was told that he was a former war criminal. And they exonerated him, and, he became prime minister by 1957. And he was the prime minister when these huge demonstrations against the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty took place in 1960. These demonstrations were so powerful that President Eisenhower was going to come to Japan in 1960 to kind of put the stamp of approval on the security treaty, and the Japanese government could not guarantee his security, and he did not come, and the U.S. was like pretty amazed at this, and he instead he went to South Korea, but that's how powerful the movement was at the time. But it's now I would say that it's very conservative voting population, and I think what the LDP did in all the time they ruled, especially in the late 50s, 60s, 70s, their whole slogan was peace and democracy. So they weren't putting money into war; they were putting money into economic projects, some of which were, very positive. And of course, Japanese companies developed their technology for civilian goods, transistor radios, televisions, all kinds of electronics. And, these were products that began to sell, all over the world, especially in the United States. In the U.S., it's sort of like, okay, we're going to have our bases there. We'll give you unfettered access to our market. That's what they did. And so Japan was exporting all kinds of goods to the U.S. And that, that began to be a concern for American businesses and capitalists in the 70s. And that's where you started to have all this, trade friction, right? And the U.S. took very strong measures, changing the value of the yen to the dollar, intervening in all kinds of ways to stop the Japanese economic export machine into the U.S. And if you look at, business magazines from that time, there's all these, the Japanese are coming, etc. The same kind of coverage happened to South Korea when it became a big exporter, later, in about 10 years later, 15 years later. But in terms of its, sovereignty, they could not have their own independent foreign policy. For years, the LDP was in power, but they wanted to open relations with China, with the People's Republic of China. But the U.S. would not even recognize China, so Japan couldn't recognize China. And then one of the big changes happened, of course, when Nixon, um, went to China and met with Mao Zedong and opened relations with China and recognized China and de-recognized Taiwan. And there's the guy who was the prime minister of Japan at the time, Sato, who was the brother of Kishi. Uh, Apparently, he wept because Nixon gave him like 1 hour's notice of this massive change in Cold War policy, right? And the Japanese, were just left. They couldn't take this by themselves, and so suddenly, Nixon just turned it upside down for them. So then they, of course, began to invest really heavily in China, and they followed the U.S. lead. But they're the most loyal pro-American subservient government, I think, in the world. The LDP. I mean, the U.S. they'll do anything to satisfy the U.S. need for military bases and hegemony in the area, and it's kind of pathetic to see. I mean, what's going on in Okinawa is, the LDP is, they're the ones building the new U.S. Marine base in Henoko, where there's been all these protests. Even in the last few days, people are protesting there, trying to stop the construction of this new base. The LDP just pours in millions and millions and millions of dollars, buys off all the local people, and fishermen in that area, instead of fishing and being fishing people, they're paid to use their boats to patrol, become security patrols and work for the contractors that are digging, that are making this new military base. So they've just have done this to buy off the Okinawan people, and after a while, I mean, 78 years of being occupied in Okinawa, that's a pretty long time. And when I was there in April, I was lucky enough to I had an interview with the vice governor of Okinawa, and he asked me, I mean, are American troops going to be here for a century? And it appears that they will be. I mean, they're making plans for, they're even expanding bases. I posted something I saw on the news yesterday about Kadena, this huge Air Force base, is going to become they're transferring all these major, U.S. Air Force drones, MQR, whatever they're called, drones to Kadena. So Kadena and all the U.S. bases there are just, they're building up, as you were saying earlier, in preparation for war with China over Taiwan, the South China Sea, etc. So, and a lot of people in Okinawa don't want to be dragged into another war, be a target again. And when we are concerned about the occupation, Israel's occupation in the West Bank and their oppression of the people of Gaza, we have to think to ourselves, like, we Americans have occupied these islands since World War II, and there is no LDP does our dirty work for the U.S. military to keep it that way, and it's totally undemocratic. It violates their rights to their land, to their rights to exist as a people free of militarism as they wish. It was, and it's I think Americans just are very blasé about occupations like Israel's of the West Bank, and we don't even think about Okinawa as being occupied land when it is.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I guess the United States is currently tooling up in the Pacific to try to either have an economic war, perhaps even a military war against China. But these sanctions and these attempts to block the rise of certain companies like Huawei or TikTok or whatever, they actually have their sort of antecedents in the 1980s when the United States felt that Japan was the big economic enemy, that it was getting too big for its boots, that its semiconductor industry was just getting too out of control, and the US basically strong armed Japan into signing all these very, very onerous trade relationship deals, which pretty much sank their economy, and to which, in a lot of ways, the Japanese economy has never really recovered. We think of
Right.
China as the workshop of the world, but in the 1980s, people thought of Japan as the workshop of the world, with companies like Sony or Panasonic or Toshiba or Hitachi or whoever, these household names that were in all American and all Westerners' houses, outcompeting American goods, outcompeting European goods, and the game of capitalism was the music stopped, and they said we're changing the rules to make sure Japan wouldn't end up on the top forever. And I think something similar is happening with China right now, whereby it has managed to really lift itself up, technologically speaking, to the point where it's now a threat to the US dominance of the global system. And that's one of the main underlying reasons why we're seeing so much talk about Taiwan, about Hong Kong, or Tibet, or Xinjiang, or whatever with regards to China, is really this underlying US worry that it's not going to be the top dog economically for too long. But
Right. But the difference is, Japan is not Japan is an ally of the U.S. and China is an enemy. But Japan had to be controlled because its economic strength and its technology was threatening American capital and American business, and so as you were saying, like the '90s, there was the famous Plaza Accords when they, and that had a lot to do with also the value of the yen to the dollar, so making Japanese exports more expensive in the U.S. market, and other steps that they took really, took a lot of that economic power away from Japan, these civilian industries. And at the same time, simultaneously around the 1990s, that's when the Pentagon and its lackey think tanks here, like Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, Committee on Foreign Relations, et cetera. They're the ones who really began to put the pressure on Japan to start rearming again and build up its military into what they called a normal nation. And this pressure really intensified with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the U.S. sort of wanted to have a more of a power sharing deal with Japan, where they would build up their military not independently, not as an independent state, but under the control of the United States.
yeah,
And that's what's happened. And gradually, this peace constitution, which was basically imposed by the U.S. occupation, but it was very much supported by the Japanese people. I mean, it was the conservatives who in Japan and the people who had been in the government during the war, who didn't want this peace constitution banning Japanese forces from fighting overseas ever again and making war ever again. That was something that was really, the Japanese people embraced that whole concept, and they still do. There's still strong support for this peace constitution, but in the last 20 years, it's been greatly eroded by different laws that have been pushed through by the LDP, such as last December, they gave Japanese self-defense forces, which is their military, the right to attack enemy bases for the first time since World War II. And this was something that was really, favored by the U.S. because they want to have they want Japanese forces to be able to fight with them in case if there's a war in Taiwan or there's a war in Korea. They want to be able to utilize Japan's military for that, and they already have, of course. South Korean military
yeah,
is very close to the U.S. And in fact, during times of war, a U.S. general commands the South Korean military, entire military. That's under the joint command they have. And now, this latest trilateral alliance that Biden announced at Camp David a few weeks ago, the Japanese, South Korean, and U.S. militaries are being, you know, combined much more than ever before, and they're hoping that this will last. And so it's a kind of alliance, of the three powers, but it's also very good for the military contractors, especially the U.S. companies that supply weapons like Aegis ships, destroyers, because they have a much bigger market if they combine, Japan, South Korea, and the United States. This is already it's been happening for quite some time, but that's the ultimate result, and both of these, this alliance, it's pushed by the U.S. It's not something that's been demanded by the South Korean people or the Japanese people. It's something that they were finally able to get through with Korea with an election of extreme right-wing pro-Japanese president who signed an agreement with Japan on the past, on Japanese war crimes during World War II, that basically exonerated Japan. They don't have to pay any reparations, and said it's all borne by South Korea. And this is an agreement that's really opposed in South Korea, and a lot of Japanese, question it as well. But this is what Biden and Blinken think is, a fabulous example of diplomacy, because it supports the U.S., strategic goals. So it's these are countries that, like I said, I respect the democracies of both South Korea and Japan, and I think in some ways South Korea, in some ways can be seen as even has a very strong democracy. After all, this is a country where they have, put on trial four former presidents, and they've been convicted and spent time in jail, for crimes against their people in Korea. So, they're able to, bring their leaders to justice that committed crimes that were, convicted of corruption, or in the case of, two generals, murder and treason for, killing many people in the city in 1980. So they've been able to, have a justice system that does bring justice to people that have all the power, which we certainly don't see here.
Sure. Yeah, I wanted to talk to you about Korea. Of course, it does have this reputation as being the good Korea, South Korea, and facing a very undemocratic, authoritarian North, bad Korea. But actually, for much of its history, the South was ruled by pro-US military dictatorships. And I know you've written about this, about the legacy of the dictatorship and how that period still affects us today. One thing you were writing about relatively recently was this Cold War era law, the National Security Law, which was used against communists and the left more generally to really radically suppress these groups in Korea and any opposition to the dictatorship. These laws are still being used to this day, though, in order to go after all sorts of progressive forces like unions and peace groups, to tar them as being controlled by the North. Could you explain how that sort of law still affects Korean politics today?
Well, a lot of Koreans say that while this national security law is on the books, there's no way you can call Korea a democracy, because it's such a sweeping law. And the thing about this law is that it was first implemented during the regime of Syngman Rhee in the late 40s. I think it was actually the law was passed when he first passed martial law, but it was kind of based on Japanese colonial security laws, which was designed to go after communists in Korea during the colonial period. And so then once Korea was divided between a communist North and then a sort of capitalist fascist South, really at the time, 40s into the 50s until the 60s, it wasn't. The people didn't have democracy in South Korea until the late 1980s, which they won by themselves. It was not handed to them by the U.S. as American officials like to think. They fought for this democracy over decades. But this law basically, if you say anything that's similar to, or you certainly repetitive of anything said in North Korea in their propaganda or their own newspapers or whatever, if you follow the North Korean line, even vaguely, you can be imprisoned and for long periods of time. And they use this all through the period of authoritarian government, as you said, to go after anybody who questioned the official policies or didn't like the dictatorship. They would throw the national security law at them, and many, hundreds of people were jailed and many executed under this law during the long dictatorship of Park Chung-hee, the general who was trained in the Japanese military during World War II. Park Chung-hee, he was in power from 61 to 79 when he was assassinated in the midst of the largest protests in Korea in years. Park Chung-hee used the national security law to go after, not just, it was rarely used actually against actual communists. It was used against Christians. It was used against anybody who could build popular support, and make their views known about opposing the dictatorship and opposing the policies of the dictatorship, or even, being anti-U.S. could they'd throw the national security law at you for that, because of course North Korea is critical of the U.S. So, you're pro-North Korean, and so it was an extreme form, of red baiting and attacking people. But it goes very deep, because it was part of a national system during the 60s, 70s, and into the 80s, 50s, all the way into the 80s. A lot of Americans have no idea that before the Korean War began in 1950, when North Korean forces, crossed the 38th parallel and overthrew the Syngman-rhee government and tried to throw the U.S. off the peninsula, there was guerrilla forces in the South that were, fighting against. They didn't want to have a divided Korea, and so some of them even fought with North Korean forces when they crossed. And anyone connected with the guerrilla movement at that time, during the Korean War, before or after, once the war was over, they were blacklisted. Like people and their families would be targeted. You couldn't get a good job at a university or a corporation or work for a government. Your name was always on some list that they maintained. And this went on, they're punishing future generations for being involved in this. And it really made living in South Korea very difficult for people. You're always under this cloud of being a suspected communist. And that didn't change until, South Korea, won their democracy, but it still took years to unravel that. And but the law still remains on the books, the national security law. And I never quite understood how, even under the last progressive president, Moon Jae-in, it was not overturned. It's something that's very difficult, for any political party to change. And I think it shows the power of really conservative forces and the military in South Korea, just that's lasted for such a long time. And South Korea is very split. This last election, when Yoon was elected, this very right-wing pro-Japanese guy, that election was the closest since 1988, their first election post-democracy. And extremely close, and it's still hard to understand how he won with such reactionary politics. But what a lot of Koreans said was what put him over the top was he wanted to. He was very much against the progressive laws on women and gender, and the protection, gender protection that had started under progressive governments there, and a lot of men, and especially young men, didn't like this. It's sort of like white people in America, responding to black people getting the vote and stuff, getting more rights and getting jobs that white people often had. So like men began to really resist this, and it's a very kind of patriarchal society, which is putting it mildly. But some people say the incel vote put Yoon over the top, and because he campaigned to end this Department of Gender Equality they had, and but there was also a right wing. There's been ever since the democratization movement. The spark for it was the uprising in Gwangju in 1980, when people actually took up guns to fight the Korean military that was massacring the citizens in the streets. 8 years later, after Gwangju, is when democracy triumphed, the movement triumphed, and they threw out the military regime. But the conservatives who had power, within that regime, they really, there's always been this reaction to the democratization movement. And so for years, the Gwangju uprising, has been attacked by the right as a pro-North Korean, rebellion. And all these incredible lies are spread about how, there was 600 North Koreans there and so on. And there's been this attack on the symbols of the democratization movement. And now Yoon is really, cracking down on the left, as you were saying. He's been using the national security law to crack down on the labor movement, a really strong labor movement in South Korea. And so, what's happened there is that some South Korean trade unionists have traveled to Cambodia and Laos, other countries in Southeast Asia, and those are countries where there are North Koreans, have embassies, and North Korea has people there, and they have restaurants there, and so often South Koreans go to those countries, and they like to go to it's a chance to meet with North Koreans, and then that's been accepted for years. But Yoon has gone after some people in the trade union movement who went there and met with North Koreans or ate at a North Korean restaurant and said they became spies for North Korea, and they used the national security law. They're still I forget how many number of people. It's about a dozen people were arrested earlier this year, for meeting with North Koreans, and so that's a lot of these meetings that they have offered no proof that they're spies. They just say, "Oh, you met with a North Korean, therefore you're a spy." But that's how they use this draconian law.
Yeah, I mean, I guess a lot of people listening to this, especially people in the West, listening to you use words like dictatorship and massacring, I think they'd be very surprised to hear that that was going on in South Korea, because we're just presented, if we ever think about South Korea at all, we just think of it as like pretty much a model, a democracy, whereas the DPRK, North Korea, is really considered like this unimaginably bizarre dystopia full of evil, scheming politicians and mindless, brainwashed drones who go around repeating what those politicians say. But I know you're very critical of the coverage of the North as well. Why is that? And what's the sort of context we're missing from the coverage of the North?
Well, basically, we're missing all context, historical context. It's as if um, they were just suddenly became this really evil people and hate the United States for some obscure reason, and there's no context to it, and so like very there's very little coverage here of what actually happened during the Korean War. And the United States Air Force, during World War II, they obliterated, dozens of Japanese cities, right? 100,000 people were killed in firebombing of Tokyo in 1945. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were destroyed by atomic bombs. And dozens of other cities were flat, burned to the ground. Well, 5 years later, they did the same thing in North Korea. And it was just total devastation, unbelievable devastation. Northern Korea during the period of Japanese colonialism was where a lot of the industry was, partly because they had the energy, they had the natural resources there to fuel industrial projects. But like the Japanese colonials built like the largest chemical factory in the world in North Korea during World War II, and there was a lot of, and so South Korea was predominantly agriculture, although they had industries. North Korea had really recovered from the colonial period, and after the war, they built up their industries. And there's a famous CIA report from 1972, I think it is, 72, where the CIA compared, North Korean industry with South Korea. And North Korea was ahead in almost everything, steel, railroads, all basic industries. They were ahead. And then, South Korea, of course, took off after they normalized relations with Japan. Japan provided, hundreds of millions of dollars in loans and investments to build the first phase of the South Korean export industries that became very, very powerful, by the 80s and 90s. But, North Korea until 1972, was doing very well economically. And it kind of had a kind of independence. They had close relations with China and the Soviet Union, of course, but they didn't become part of the Soviet sphere in terms of its common market or the Chinese. They always kind of kept a certain amount of independence from both of those great powers, and that they wanted to keep their independence because independence is a big deal for Korea. And then North Korea. It's a very centralized kind of economic structure like you have in a lot of state socialist communist states, centralized power. But they also depended for many years on low cost subsidized oil from the Soviet Union, and they did have a big market in selling their industrial goods to Eastern Europe, to countries like East Germany or Czechoslovakia and so on. When the Soviet Union collapsed and the Berlin Wall came down, and those, there was that whole, the U.S. won the Cold War. North Korea lost a lot of its markets. It also lost its subsidized oil from the Soviet Union. It had its agricultural system was largely based on oil to make their fertilizer, and so there's oil-based, petroleum-based, fertilizer agriculture economy. And when that they lost that oil, then there was a terrible drought that went on for a few years, and basically their agricultural economy collapsed, and a couple million people. There really was very serious starvation in North Korea in the late 1990s. It went on for quite a while, and of course, this was when they began to build their nuclear weapons because the U.S. introduced nuclear weapons into South Korea in the 1950s. And then, over with these military alliances, Japan and South Korea. The South Korean military, of course, was very big, very large, and they started building up the Japanese military. And of course, the U.S. has all these, major bases. And so, with the Soviet Union no longer existing, and China growing independently, and China building its own system, North Korea did not have the nuclear umbrella that South Korea has and Japan has, and they really feared U.S. Attempted regime change, because the U.S. policy has always been, still really is, rather than negotiate with North Korea, get rid of its regime. And so they've been under a kind of, they've been in a war mentality for many years, decades, and I think, they have a very, very powerful military in North Korea, and the North Korea, it's a very authoritarian state. It's a no doubt it's a dictatorship. Lots of political controls, enormous amount of political controls, but they really fear the power of the U.S. and they've stood up to the U.S. by building nuclear weapons. Now there was a period of decades in the 80s and 90s into the 2000s when they really tried to normalize relations with the U.S. They wanted to have normal ties. They wanted to end the state of war. And, there's been attempts when there's been South Korean progressives in power, like Kim Dae-jung, who started his sunshine policy in the late 90s. And Kim Dae-jung was the first South Korean president to visit North Korea in 2000. They've made progress on, trying to end the tensions and defuse the tensions and build relations. And then during the sunshine period, Kim Dae-jung, for about 10 years, 97 to 2007, relations were pretty good between South and North Korea. And people might remember that during the Bill Clinton administration in 94, when North Korea withdrew from the nuclear, the treaty, the NPT, and started processing plutonium to build nuclear weapons, the U.S. almost went to war with North Korea. They almost were using all the bases in Okinawa and Japan and South Korea were all being prepped to have a military strike on North Korea. It almost happened. There almost was a war then. And that was when Jimmy Carter made his famous trip, to North Korea and met with Kim Il-sung, the founder and leader at the time. And they kind of hammered out this agreement, that they hoped would lead to some kind of normalization. And what the agreement was, North Korea basically, shut down its plutonium, its nuclear processing system for almost a decade. And, there was a time when the U.S., South Korea, and Japan were building them an alternative. They were building a light water reactor in North Korea to supply them electricity while they, got rid of their Soviet reactors they were able to make plutonium out of. And so there was this period of, developing relations. And at the end of the Clinton administration, they were on the verge of an agreement to end. The North Koreans were ready to sign an agreement to end their missile production, to stop their missile program. And there was the Secretary of State at the time, Albright, was in Pyongyang and met with Kim Jong-il, who was the second North Korean leader, the son of Kim Jong of the first Kim, and they were on the verge of normalizing ties. I mean, the U.S. and North Korea were actually looking at embassies. The U.S. was looking at the old East German embassy in Pyongyang, and North Korea was hoping to of an embassy in Washington. And I think that process would have continued if George Bush had been elected here, because George Bush immediately meeting with Kim Dae-jung, who had started this evolution toward engagement, he just said, we can't trust North Korea, and that's it. We're not going to negotiate anymore. And there went that, and within 3 years, North Korea built their nuclear weapon, right?
Yeah,
So
he put them on the axis of evil list there, right?
he put them on the axis of evil, and then they saw the U.S. attacking, invading Iraq for weapons of mass destruction, supposedly, and then they saw the U.S. and NATO taking out Gaddafi in Libya after they had gotten rid of their nuclear weapons under an agreement, negotiated by NATO and the U.S. And then they got rid of them anyway, and they're like, well, even if with an agreement to get rid of our nuclear weapons, it looks like these neocons in the U.S. would attack us anyway. So we're going to go ahead and build these. And then there was when Moon Jae-in was elected president of South Korea in 2017, part of his platform was in re-engaging with North Korea. I was in South Korea. I was in Gwangju actually when he was running for president, and he would hold pictures up of Kim Dae-jung and the next president, No Moo-hyun, who succeeded Kim in these engagement policies. And, he was campaigning on this, let's have peace again with North Korea. And, there was a period of time starting in the end of 2017, 2018, there was major, summits between North and South Korea. And then through the mediation of South Korea, they convinced Trump to meet with Kim Jong-un to try to hammer out a longer-term agreement that would end the war basically between the U.S. and North Korea. And that was, during that time, there was a lot of major decrease of tensions. North Korea was not testing its missiles or anything. And then the talks collapsed in 2019, and Kim Jong Un offered to shut down about 80% of his nuclear facilities, and then in return he wanted the U.S. to lift sanctions that had been imposed by the U.S. and the UN after they started firing ICBMs in 2017. And so that agreement was on the table. I mean, literally, it had a lunch table, right? They were going to celebrate it in Hanoi when they met in Hanoi. And then John Bolton and Pompeo, who was the Secretary of State at the time, they said, you can't do this. And Trump backed out of the agreement, walked away from this lunch table that had been set out for them all to celebrate an agreement. And ever since then, tensions have gone through the roof again, because, Biden when he ran against Trump. I mean, I don't have any love for Trump at all. I mean, I've opposed Trump in many ways. I think he's a fascist. But the opening to North Korea, meeting with Kim Jong-un, was like one of the only few good things he did, in my view. When Biden was running for office, he basically said that was like Neville Chamberlain appeasement, meeting with gave legitimacy to North Korea, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And now we're North Korea, after Biden made clear he wasn't interested in that kind of agreement, they said, okay, we're gonna really develop our missiles, to really be able to hit the U.S. bases in Japan and Okinawa and Guam, South Korea, and they have done this, and they still haven't tested any more nuclear weapons, but North Korea, it's a militaristic state, but their military power, they don't have anywhere near the military spending of South Korea, or of course the U.S. or Japan. I mean, so they're surrounded by this enormous military power, and they see this as their deterrence. And I think until something changes in that dynamic, that's going to be the situation.
Sure.
Rising tension.
We're running out of time, but I do want to ask you one very quick question. I don't know if you've got a quick answer for this, but is peace or unification possible in North Korea, and would the United States be for or against that?
Well, I think the U.S. has always been against unification, and they've always. I mean, they want the southern part of Korea to be part of their empire, and linked up with Japan. That's what this trilateral alliance is all about: maintaining U.S. forces there basically forever. Biden actually used the word forever. We'll keep this agreement forever. But, a lot of people in Korea, I mean, for years, unification was, something that united, Koreans from all classes and, even, political parties, right? Right and left would support the idea of unification. But as time has gone on and, the Korean War was 70 years ago, people, new generations start, lose that interest. When I was in Korea in April and I was meeting with people I had known in South Korea in the 80s who'd been, leaders of the democratic struggle, I heard something interesting, which was like this one person I've known, since the 80s, who's still an activist. He's about my age. And he said, we don't really. First of all, he said, like, there's no communist in South Korea. It's ridiculous to think that we want a communist takeover. But and he also said, we're not interested in like a unified country that's one government, but we want to have freedom. We want a country free of foreign military forces, and we want to be able to be free to go to North Korea and North Koreans to come here. We want to, mix and see our people in the North, not necessarily in one system, but maybe one country that's, two systems, but nevertheless, an independent country that there may be a communist system in the North and a sort of more capitalist system in the South, but they want to be able to not have these military tensions and be able to travel and be able to meet your families and go hang out with your family if you want to. And so it's a sort of a different approach than thinking about unification, but I think it's in a way it's a similar concept to what has been developed by say Kim Dae-jung, and also talked about in North Korea, which was have one state, but it's two systems. It's sort of independent, states within one country, and I think that's a possibility. But it would take eventually there would have to be a country free of foreign troops, and the only foreign troops in Korea are American. There's no foreign forces in North Korea. There haven't been since the mid 50s. Late 50s was when all the Chinese soldiers left. The Soviet forces pulled out even before the Korean War. So, the U.S. has been there this whole time, and until U.S. strategic views change, and they can say, well, we don't. I mean, what is the reason to have troops in South Korea? The reason they always it's to help them defend themselves against North Korea. Well, South Korea's military is far bigger than North Korea's. There's no doubt that South Korea does not have nuclear weapons, but South Korea certainly has an army that could defend itself against North Korea. And a military force that could as well. And U.S. forces are there for other reasons. They're there, like the troops they have a lot of Koreans were shocked during the Iraq War. There's this base I've written about, Camp Casey, which is second U.S. Second Infantry base on the DMZ. During the Iraq War, after Bush went into Iraq, like that base, one day to the next, it was like emptied out. All the American soldiers were sent off to Iraq, right? And these are American soldiers that Koreans were told were defending us against North Korea. Suddenly, the U.S. has a need in Iraq for them, so they go off, and so they're like, well, if they're so badly needed against North Korea, why did the U.S. just, fly them all to Iraq? So I think now it's even harder because since Biden did this trilateral alliance with South Korea and Japan, meaning that Japan might be involved in any kind of military conflict with North Korea. Kim Jong-un, went to the Russia Far East and met with Putin and toured some of their military plants, and they're talking have developing closer military ties now. They haven't really done much about it, but that was their response. And so it really is back to old Cold War days where it's kind of like it now. They're after this long period of trying to have normal ties with the U.S., North Korea's like given up on that completely. And while the U.S. war with North Korea is going on, and it's important to say that the Korean War, only ended in armistice in 1953. It never ended a formal peace treaty. As long as the U.S. has this, we want to eliminate North Korea, or we want regime change in North Korea. There's no chance that North and South can build any kind of peace between themselves. And so I think, as an American, I've been writing this for years. We need to change. South Korea is, Korea is not the United States property. It belongs to Korea, and we've had it. We've used it as our property since the moment the United States military occupied it in the aftermath of World War II. And this, I think while they do have, they have developed their own dynamic democracies internally, both of them, South Korea and Japan. There's this issue of U.S. control and U.S. involvement in their politics, which constrains their, as we were talking before, their sovereignty. And I think that's the barrier to any kind of peaceful solution of the situation in Northeast Asia. We have to change. The United States has to change, and that's a longer question. But we love our military power, and the U.S. is militaristic, hegemonic power in that area, and has been since the end of World War II.
Yeah, no matter what region of the world you look to, it always seems that the United States is there poking its nose in. We've been speaking with Tim Shorrock today, the investigative journalist and writer. Tim, my very last question for you is where can people follow your work and writing?
Best place is timshorrock.com, Tim, Shorrock. You can find my website very easily. And I have a lot of, not only, I post stuff occasionally there, news stories and analysis, but I have lots of documents up there I have stories up there, my basically 40 years of journalism, 45 years of journalism. And I have lots of the documents I've obtained from under Freedom of Information Act and other ways that are posted up there. And I try to keep posting new ones too. But that's the best place.
That's great. Okay, if you've listened long enough here, I'll give a quick plug for our Patreon. If you are in a financial position to support us, head over to patreon.com and support us there. If you're not, you can still help us by liking this stream and sharing it with your friends. Okay, until next week, this has been another edition of the Midcast. I'm Alan McLeod. See you next time.